police officer hit Chuck Norris with a baton, but seconds later, he regretted it deeply. The afternoon sun hung high over Griffith Park, casting long, golden shadows across the landscape. The air carried the scent of freshly cut grass, mingling with the distant aroma of food from a nearby vendor. A gentle breeze rustled through the towering oaks and sycamores, offering brief moments of relief from the warmth of the day. It was a scene of quiet harmony. Families lounging on picnic blankets, children chasing each other along the winding paths, and joggers keeping a steady pace as their rhythmic footfalls blended with the soft chirping of birds. Laughter echoed from a group of teenagers gathered near the playground, their carefree conversations mixing with the hum of the city beyond the park's borders. Amidst the life and movement, one man sat apart from the rest. He occupied a weathered wooden bench, positioned just beneath the shade of an old tree, its sprawling branches shielding him from the glare of the sun. His posture was relaxed, yet there was something deliberate about the way he sat. One booted foot resting over the other, his hands methodically tossing small handfuls of birdseed onto the pavement. The pigeons around him responded eagerly, fluttering down in waves, pecking at the kernels with frantic energy. But the man himself remained still, watching them with an almost meditative patience. His face, rugged and lined with experience, told the story of a life well lived. He wore faded blue jeans, a simple brown shirt, and a leather belt that had long since lost its original shine. A cowboy hat, slightly tilted forward, shielded his eyes from the sun, casting a shadow over his expression. His beard, neatly trimmed but streaked with silver, framed a jawline that had seen its fair share of battles, though now it held only quiet wisdom. This was no ordinary old man. This was Chuck Norris, a man whose name carried a weight of legend, whose history was written in countless battles, films, and tales of unmatched skill. But here, in this moment, none of that mattered. For once, he was not a warrior, not a teacher, not an enforcer of justice. He was simply a man enjoying a peaceful afternoon, blending into the world around him. The city moved on without noticing, and that was exactly how he liked it. Here, there was no need to fight, no urgency to act, no enemies, no threats. Just the simple pleasure of feeding pigeons, listening to the rustling leaves, and feeling the warm breeze against his skin. But peace is a fragile thing, easily disturbed by those who mistake stillness for weakness. But peace is a fragile thing, easily disturbed by those who mistake stillness for weakness. The steady hum of the park was interrupted by the sharp, deliberate sound of heavy boots striking pavement. The rhythm was different from the light steps of joggers or the casual stroll of park visitors. This was the kind of walk that demanded attention, the kind that made people instinctively straighten their posture or lower their gaze. It was a walk of authority, one that carried an unspoken expectation of obedience. Officer Dan Cross moved with purpose, his broad-shouldered frame cutting a straight path through the meandering flow of parkgoers. His uniform was immaculate, the deep navy fabric pressed to perfection, each crease in place as if ironed with military precision. A gleaming badge caught the sunlight, pinned firmly to his chest, a symbol of law and order, or at least his version of it. His mirrored sunglasses reflected the world around him, making it impossible to tell exactly where he was looking, but it was clear that he was always watching, always assessing. His utility belt sat heavy on his hips, stocked with every tool of enforcement: handcuffs, a radio, a taser, a baton, and the ever-present weight of his firearm. Everything was polished, neatly arranged, and ready for use. For many who had crossed paths with Officer Cross, his presence meant one thing: trouble. He wasn't known for kindness or patience. He wasn't the type to offer a friendly nod to the elderly or a reassuring smile to children. He was a man who relished power, who took satisfaction in the way people stiffened when he passed. He didn't enforce the law because he believed in justice. He did it because he enjoyed the feeling of control. He had spent years molding his presence into something that commanded submission, and it had worked, until now. As his gaze swept over the park, scanning for anything that might require his attention, his focus landed on one man. An old man, sitting alone on a bench, barely moving. Chuck Norris. There was something about him that immediately irritated Cross. He wasn't jogging, wasn't reading a newspaper, wasn't watching children play. He was just sitting there, too still, too calm, as if the world around him didn't exist. He didn't fit into the orderly structure that Cross liked to impose on his surroundings. The officer had seen men like this before, stubborn relics of another time, the kind who thought they were above the rules. A flicker of disdain curled at the corner of Cross's mouth as he altered his course, stepping off the paved walkway and heading directly toward the bench. His boots hit the ground with a deliberate weight, each step measured, controlled. This wouldn't take long. A few firm words, a clear display of authority, and the old man would be on his way. A few passers-by noticed the shift in energy. A woman walking her dog hesitated, her steps slowing as she glanced between the officer and the seated man. A group of young men near a picnic table exchanged quiet looks, recognizing the signs of an impending confrontation. They had seen Cross at work before. They knew how these encounters usually ended. As Cross closed the final few steps, his shadow stretched long across the bench, falling over Chuck like a dark omen. He stopped directly in front of him, planting his feet wide, hands resting firmly on his belt. The presence he had spent years perfecting, the stance, the authority, the silent demand for acknowledgement, was now in full effect. But Chuck didn't move. The pigeons around him pecked at the last scattered seeds, unfazed by the officer's arrival. The leaves overhead rustled gently in the breeze, the only sound breaking the tension between the two men. Cross exhaled through his nose, irritation bubbling beneath the surface. This was the part where people looked up, recognized his authority, and responded accordingly. But the old man remained exactly as he was, as if he hadn't even noticed the officer was there. That wasn't going to fly. Cross shifted his weight slightly, adjusting his stance. His fingers flexed near his baton, feeling its presence at his side. He didn't like being ignored. He cleared his throat, the sharp sound cutting through the warm air, a nonverbal command demanding attention. Still, Chuck did not react. There was no startled glance, no nervous shifting, not even the smallest flicker of acknowledgement. His hands remained steady, dropping another handful of birdseed onto the ground, watching as the pigeons eagerly fluttered around his feet. A flicker of something unfamiliar passed through Cross's mind. Not quite confusion, not quite hesitation, but something close. He wasn't used to this. His presence alone had always been enough. But here, in the middle of a public park, a single old man was sitting as if the badge on his chest meant nothing. Cross clenched his jaw. His patience was thin to begin with, and right now, it was wearing even thinner. This wasn't a request. It was an order. And if words weren't enough to get a response, he wasn't above using something more persuasive. He took a step closer, his polished boot stopping just inches from Chuck's foot. His hand hovered near his baton, the weight of it familiar, reassuring. This wasn't going to take long. All he needed was a reason, one excuse to put this old man in his place. The sun continued its slow descent. The shadows stretched longer across the ground. And yet, Chuck Norris remained still. The silence between them grew heavier, pressing against the warm air of the park. Cross stood over the seated man, his feet planted wide, his hands resting firmly on his belt. His polished badge gleamed in the sunlight, a symbol of authority that had always commanded respect, until now. His shadow stretched long across the wooden bench, dark and imposing, but it might as well have been cast over an empty seat for all the reaction it received. Chuck remained still, his posture unchanged, his focus solely on the pigeons pecking at the ground near his boots. With a steady hand, he reached into the small bag at his side, pulling out another handful of birdseed and letting it scatter across the pavement. The birds fluttered and cooed, oblivious to the tension settling thick in the air. Cross narrowed his eyes behind his mirrored sunglasses, his jaw tightening as irritation crawled up his spine. This wasn't how things were supposed to go. He was used to compliance. A stiff nod, a mumbled apology, a quick retreat. Those were the usual responses when he made his presence known. But this man was different. There was no nervous shifting, no quick glance of uncertainty. It wasn't defiance either. It was something worse, indifference. The officer took a slow breath, reining in his patience. Maybe the old man didn't hear him. Maybe he was just slow to react. Either way, this needed to be handled. He cleared his throat, loud and deliberate, the sound slicing through the soft murmurs of the park. "You can't sit here all day," he said, his voice firm, clipped. "Move along." Silence. Chuck didn't so much as twitch. He didn't acknowledge the officer's presence, didn't turn his head, didn't even pause in his slow, methodical motion of dropping birdseed. The pigeons, far more interested in their meal than in human affairs, continued their frantic pecking at the ground. Cross's patience thinned, his fingers twitching at his side. He wasn't accustomed to being ignored. His badge meant something. His uniform carried weight. And yet, here was this old man, sitting there as if none of it mattered. The muscles in Cross's jaw flexed as frustration bubbled just beneath his skin. Enough of this. He took a step closer, the polished tip of his boot stopping mere inches from Chuck's foot. The officer loomed over him, his shadow swallowing the bench whole. His stance was rigid, radiating the kind of authority that all but demanded respect. But Chuck didn't move. Cross exhaled sharply through his nose, the slow burn of irritation turning to something sharper, something edged with a hint of anger. He had given an order. He had made himself clear. He wasn't the type to repeat himself, but the old man was forcing his hand. He adjusted his stance, shifting his weight slightly. His fingers flexed near his baton, feeling the cool, familiar weight of it. It wasn't about violence. It never was, not at first. It was about control, a show of force, a reminder of who was in charge. And if words weren't enough to get a reaction, maybe something else would be. Without another word, Cross lifted his baton and brought it down hard against the wooden bench, just inches from Chuck's leg. The crack of impact shattered the peaceful hum of the park, sending a sharp, violent sound through the air. A few nearby birds took flight in a flurry of wings, startled by the sudden noise. A couple of joggers turned their heads, their steps slowing for a brief moment before they carried on, assuming it was nothing more than an officer doing his job. But Chuck didn't flinch. He didn't recoil. He didn't startle. He didn't even acknowledge the baton's presence. The pigeons had scattered. The noise had sent ripples of unease through the air, but the man sitting on the bench remained exactly as he was, motionless, unshaken, as if the moment had never happened. Cross felt something shift in his chest. Not quite fear, not quite doubt, but something uncomfortably close to both. He had expected a reaction, expected the old man to jerk back, to stammer an apology, to at least look up and meet his gaze. But instead, it was as if Cross himself didn't exist, as if the officer, the uniform, the badge, the authority, none of it mattered. That wasn't normal. Cross's grip on his baton tightened, his knuckles turning white around the handle. His pulse ticked in his jaw as he fought back the unfamiliar sensation creeping up his spine. He wasn't going to let some stubborn old man make him look weak. Not here. Not in front of a growing audience. A flicker of movement caught his eye. A woman walking her dog had paused a few feet away, her gaze darting between him and the seated man. At a nearby picnic table, a group of young men had fallen silent, their conversation forgotten as they watched the scene unfold. Their eyes weren't wide with fear or concern. No, they were waiting, watching, curious to see what would happen next. Cross clenched his teeth. No, he was not going to lose control of this situation. The old man had made his choice. Now, Cross would make his. Cross's jaw clenched as the old man remained motionless, completely unfazed by the sharp crack of the baton against the bench. A slow burn of humiliation crept up his neck, settling deep in his chest. He could feel the weight of eyes on him, the silent judgment of the bystanders who had started to take notice. He could hear the faint murmurs, the hushed conversations, the subtle shifting of people who lingered just close enough to witness whatever was about to unfold. No, he wasn't going to let this happen. He wasn't going to let some nobody old man make a fool of him. His patience had run its course. Enough was enough. With a swift, aggressive motion, Cross reached forward and grabbed Chuck's shoulder, his fingers pressing in with the kind of grip that left no room for argument. It was meant to be a warning, a final push, a physical declaration that this was no longer a request. It was an order. But the moment his hand made contact, everything changed. In an instant, before Cross could even register what was happening, Chuck's hand moved. It wasn't a sudden yank, not a violent twist, not the desperate struggle of someone trying to break free. No, it was something far worse. It was effortless. A single, fluid motion, smooth and precise, as if Chuck had been expecting this exact moment all along. Cross barely had time to react before he felt it, the unmistakable shift of power. His wrist, the same wrist that had been so firm and commanding just seconds ago, was now trapped in a grip so strong, so impossibly controlled, that it sent an immediate jolt of alarm through his chest. It wasn't painful. It wasn't aggressive, but it was absolute. His instinct screamed at him to pull back, to reclaim his dominance, to reassert the control that had been stripped from him in a heartbeat. He yanked his arm, expecting resistance, expecting a struggle, but instead, his own force worked against him. His balance shifted, his footing faltered, and in the blink of an eye, his baton, his weapon, his tool of authority, was gone. Chuck Norris had taken it. Cross blinked, his mind scrambling to process the reality of what had just happened. One moment, the baton had been secure in his grasp. The next, it was no longer his. And worse, Chuck didn't even hold it like a weapon. He simply turned it in his hand, examining it with quiet curiosity, as if weighing its worth. Then, with a slow, deliberate movement, he let it slip from his fingers, the baton falling to the ground with a hollow thud. Like it was nothing. The act stung more than any insult ever could. It wasn't just that Chuck had taken the weapon. It was the way he discarded it, the way he dismissed it as useless, as insignificant, as if it didn't belong in this moment, as if it wasn't even worth keeping. Humiliation burned in Cross's chest, the heat of it creeping up his spine. He felt exposed, stripped of the authority he had carried into this encounter. And the worst part? People had seen it. The small crowd that had begun to gather was no longer just casually watching. They were invested now. Their murmurs had changed, shifting from mild curiosity to something else entirely. Confusion, awe, a growing realization that something unexpected was happening. Cross couldn't let this stand. The old man wasn't stronger than him. He wasn't faster. He was just some washed-up relic, some stubborn fool who thought he could defy an officer of the law. And yet, for the first time in his career, Cross felt something foreign creeping into his gut. Hesitation. He shoved the feeling down, hard. His pride flared, hot and uncontrollable. His muscles tensed as anger took hold. He refused to be made a fool of. Not here. Not in front of witnesses. His reputation, his authority, his very presence as an officer, it all hinged on what he did next. And so, without thinking, without strategy, without any real plan beyond regaining control, Cross lunged. It was a mistake. Chuck saw it before it even happened. The moment Cross moved, Chuck's hand was already there, already in position, already prepared. And just like before, it wasn't a struggle. There was no violent clash, no show of force. There was only precision, a seamless transition from one movement to the next. Cross felt it again. That same terrifying, effortless control. His arm was caught mid-motion, redirected before it could make contact. And then, just as easily as the baton had been taken, his gun was no longer his. The weight of it disappeared from his side. For a split second, his breath stalled. His brain stuttered, unable to catch up with what his body already knew. His fingers twitched, reaching instinctively for his holster, for the one thing that had always given him ultimate authority in any situation. But it was too late. Chuck Norris now held the gun. Cross's world narrowed to that single, undeniable truth. His heart pounded against his ribs, his pulse roaring in his ears. His mouth went dry. His entire body felt suddenly, horribly light, as if the ground beneath him had shifted and left him weightless. And then, just as before, Chuck looked at the weapon, turning it in his hand, testing its balance with the same quiet patience. He didn't point it. He didn't threaten. He didn't even hold it with any real sense of urgency. And then, just like the baton, he lowered himself, setting it down gently on the ground beside the other discarded tool of power. The message was clear. These things meant nothing to him. The murmurs in the crowd grew louder. People exchanged glances, whispering in hushed tones. Some reached for their phones, their screens reflecting the afternoon sun as they recorded what was unfolding. This wasn't just a simple encounter anymore. It was something else entirely. Cross swallowed hard, his throat tight, his breathing shallow, his hands clenched into fists at his sides, his fingers curling into his palms as frustration and disbelief warred inside him. This wasn't happening. It couldn't be happening. He had been trained for physical confrontations. He had spent years perfecting the techniques officers used to subdue suspects, to maintain order. But this was something else. His authority, his weapons, his very sense of control. Chuck had taken all of it without breaking a sweat, and Cross had never felt so powerless in his life. Cross's breath came in short, uneven bursts, his chest rising and falling as the weight of the moment pressed down on him. He had lost control. Completely. His baton was gone. His gun was gone. And worse, he hadn't even seen it happen. He had spent his career believing that power came from control, from force, from the unshakable presence of authority. But in mere seconds, all of it had been stripped away. Not by violence, not by brute strength, but by something far more terrifying: absolute skill. His fingers twitched at his sides, his muscles coiling with a final, desperate urge to act, to do something, anything to take back what had slipped through his grasp. His pride screamed at him, refused to let him accept this. If he didn't fight back, if he didn't reclaim control, he would never live this down. The murmurs of the crowd were growing louder now, their whispers blending into a low hum of disbelief. He could feel their eyes on him, watching, waiting. The weight of humiliation pressed against his skin like a suffocating heat. And then, before his body could fully commit to his final mistake, Chuck moved. It wasn't flashy. It wasn't aggressive. Just another effortless, precise motion. So quick, so smooth, that Cross barely registered it before it was too late. In one seamless shift, his momentum was redirected, his own weight working against him. His balance was gone, his footing lost. And then, nothing. The world tilted. His back hit the ground before he even realized he was falling. For a moment, he lay there, blinking up at the sky, his mind struggling to catch up with the reality of what had just happened. He had been taken down without a single strike. No punch, no kick, no force. Just pure skill, a mastery so complete that it had made him powerless in a way he had never known before. The shock of it coursed through him, a cold wave crashing over the burning heat of his frustration. Then came the gasps. The crowd, now fully engaged, reacted all at once. Some covered their mouths in disbelief. Others exchanged wide-eyed glances, their murmurs turning into hushed excitement. And then, the inevitable. The sharp, quiet clicks of phones being lifted, cameras rolling, capturing every humiliating second of his downfall. Cross's heart pounded against his ribs. He had to get up. He had to fix this. But before he could even attempt to scramble to his feet, movement from the edge of the crowd caught his attention. Two uniformed officers were making their way through the gathering spectators, their expressions sharp with concern. They moved quickly, their eyes scanning the situation, assessing the scene. Cross felt a flicker of relief. Reinforcements. Finally. But the moment the senior officer, a grizzled man with graying temples and years of experience in his gaze, laid eyes on Chuck Norris, something shifted. Recognition flashed across his face. And then, in an instant, his entire demeanor changed. The rigid stance softened. The sharp alertness dulled, replaced by something quieter, something more understanding. He knew. He understood exactly what had happened here. The silence between them was heavy, thick with unspoken realization. The senior officer exhaled, then turned his gaze down to Cross, still sprawled on the ground. His expression was unreadable, but his voice, when he spoke, was firm. Final. Give me your badge and your gun. The words hit like a hammer, harder than any physical blow ever could. Cross's stomach twisted violently, his pulse roaring in his ears. His breath hitched. No, not like this. Not here. Not in front of everyone. He clenched his jaw, every muscle in his body screaming in protest. His fingers curled into the ground, grasping for something, anything to hold on to. But there was nothing left. His authority had been dismantled, his power stripped away. And now, there was only one thing left to do. For a long, agonizing moment, he didn't move. He wanted to argue, to fight, to salvage what little dignity remained. But deep down, he knew the truth. There was no coming back from this. With slow, stiff movements, He reached for the metal badge pinned to his chest. He had worn it for years, carried it like a shield, believing it made him untouchable. But now, in his trembling fingers, it felt small, light, meaningless. He unpinned it and placed it in the senior officer's waiting hand. Then came the gun. His grip was reluctant, his fingers hesitant as they curled around the handle for the last time. It had been his ultimate authority, his final reassurance in every situation. But now, it was nothing more than an empty weight. He removed the magazine, cleared the chamber, and handed it over. And just like that, his career, his reputation, his entire sense of self, shattered in mere minutes. Cross stood frozen for a moment, his hands now empty, his entire world unraveling around him. The weight of his badge was gone. The cold steel of his gun no longer rested at his hip. Everything that had once made him feel powerful had been taken from him, not by force, not by struggle, but by something he couldn't even begin to comprehend. The senior officer gave a small nod, then turned to the younger officer beside him. "Escort him out." The words left no room for argument. Cross stiffened, his jaw locking, his face burning with shame. He wanted to fight it, to resist, to claw back any shred of dignity that remained. But there was nothing left to cling to. He had lost. Completely. The younger officer stepped forward, placing a firm but careful hand on Cross's arm. There was no violence, no aggression, just the quiet understanding that there was nothing more to be done. Without another word, Cross allowed himself to be led away. His steps were heavy, his head low, his once unshakable presence now nothing more than a shadow of what it had been. The crowd parted as he passed, their murmurs hushed but unmistakable. Some whispered to each other, their eyes flicking between Cross and the man who had just undone him with nothing but patience and skill. Others simply watched, their expressions a mixture of awe and disbelief. A few still had their phones raised, capturing the final moments of a man who had once believed himself untouchable. And Chuck? He never even glanced in Cross's direction, as if nothing had happened, as if the last few minutes had been no more significant than a passing breeze. Chuck simply leaned forward and reached for his bag of birdseed. He pulled out another handful, scattering it gently onto the pavement. The pigeons, who had briefly scattered in the commotion, fluttered back without hesitation. To them, nothing had changed. The world carried on, and so did Chuck. He had never come here looking for trouble. He hadn't sought out a fight, hadn't raised a fist, hadn't spoken a single harsh word. But when the fight had come to him, when authority had mistaken patience for weakness, he had ended it without breaking a sweat. Justice had spoken, not with violence, not with force, but with quiet, undeniable certainty. And now it was over.